Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's World Homocystinuria Awareness Day panel, Navigating the Maze. We are so pleased to have our esteemed panel and moderator, Ben Massengale, with us. Tomorrow is World Homocystinuria Awareness Day, and this year's theme is Navigating the Maze. For many families and patients, the diagnostic odyssey, it can be long and complicated, many times mimicking that of a maze. For many patients, it can take many years and many doctors before they get a diagnosis, but the journey doesn't stop there. For many patients, even after the diagnosis, they still have to go through many doctors and many different treatments to find something that actually works for them. And still, even after then, they need to adjust along the way. So tonight we have Ben Massengale acting as our moderator, and we have three esteemed panelists. And they will be sharing their journey to diagnosis and what it's looked like within their respective types of HCU. So thank you very much for being with us. And Ben, you can take it from here.
All right. Thanks, Danae. I just want to take a second and say thank you to HC&U Network America for letting me host. This is the first time I've ever gotten to do anything like this, so I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you to the panelists for being on, Julie and Melanie and Shaina. Before we get started, I would like for you to introduce yourselves, maybe tell us your name, your child's name, how old they are, and the type of HCU they have, and the age that they were diagnosed, because I know that varies for a lot of people. We'll start with Melanie, if that's all right.
Hi, my name's Melanie, and I'm from Vancouver in Canada, and I have a 10-year-old, almost 11, he'll be 11 next week, little boy named Mason, and he has classical homocystinuria. Unfortunately, he was missed at birth, and he was diagnosed at age 8, so we're coming up on 3 years now.
Thank you, Melanie. We'll go to Shaina. Sorry, Shaina, you're muted.
Sorry there, guys. Hi, everybody. My name is Shaina Shapiro, and I am Casey's mom. And Casey was very much the same kind of story, missed at a newborn screening. He has cobalamin C, and he was diagnosed when he was transitioning between 3 and 4 months. And he is now coming up on a year old in the next couple of weeks here.
All right. Thank you, Shaina. And then we'll go to Julie. Sorry, Julie, can you hear us?
I can. I'm so sorry. My computer just shut off. I'm on my phone.
No, you're fine. We're just introducing ourselves, telling us your child's name, age, and type of HCU.
Sure. My daughter is Amy Sullivan. She's 16 years old, and she has MTHFR deficiency or severe MTHFR.
All right, thank you. And again, thanks for being with me and bearing with me through this. So our first discussion point, when we talk about the maze of diagnosis, that starts long before we get an official diagnosis of HCU or cobalamin G or cobalamin C or severe MTHFR. So when you answer these questions, I want you to think about prior to an official diagnosis, because we'll talk about getting that official diagnosis later in the discussion. But the first discussion point is the onset of symptoms. So some of the things that I would like to talk about, what symptoms did your child first display that made you think something was wrong, something wasn't quite right? Maybe talk about how many doctors you had to see trying to find a diagnosis, because I know often you have to bounce from doctor to doctor. And just your initial reactions to hearing that we don't really know what's wrong, or it could be this, or it could be that. just the very first steps of finding that diagnosis. Melanie, if you could start, maybe speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, sure. So, as I mentioned, Mason, who's almost 11 now, was 8 at diagnosis, as he was missed at birth. And, grow as a baby and as a little boy, he was always really healthy. We didn't have any serious concerns about his health at all. The reason Mason was diagnosed was at a routine eye doctor's appointment when he was 7.5, almost 8. The doctor saw something when he was looking in his eyes, and it kind of got the ball rolling on what ended up being the diagnosis a few months later. But to be honest, when I really look back in hindsight, there were certainly some things developmentally with Mason where he was a little bit more behind than some of the other babies that were around us, but nothing severe. For example, he started walking, 3 or 4 months later than most of the other babies, but it was still sort of on par with what any doctor would think was okay. So there's no huge red flags. So in that sense, everything was okay up until we got that routine eye doctor's appointment. That's when everything changed for us.
All right, thank you for that. Julie, would you like to talk a little bit about your first steps with Amy?
Sure. Amy is our third child in like 5 years. So we did notice that she was a little delayed with like walking and talking. Other than that, was in good health, but we always had excuses for why she maybe wasn't walking or talking because of the siblings and being in and out of the car. And so we didn't really think that it was an issue. And then as she got older, we ruled out, we did eye doctor and hearing. She had some trouble in school. We went to a neurologist to check out her, to try to figure out what the learning differences might be. We went to an endocrinologist because there were some anti-thyroid antibodies. We saw an orthopedist because she had in-towing, which progressively got worse as she got older. So right from, I'd say, age 4 or 5, we started seeing regularly many different doctors to try to get an answer, but we really didn't have any one person, like one point person who could connect all the dots. So it really wasn't until she started having seizures at the age of 12, and the neurologist recommended genetic testing. That's when we started to work with the geneticist, who then found a diagnosis for her. And then it all sort of made sense when we look back. Also, anxiety and depression. So she was already in therapy, and we were seeing a psychologist just to add to the list of people we were working with. And then she didn't get her diagnosis until 14. So it's just been 2 years that we've been kind of navigating the maze, continuing to navigate.
All right, thank you for that. And then Shaina, would you like to talk a little bit about Casey?
Yeah. So when Casey was born, newborn screening was fine. He was in great health. I think it was around like 3 months that we started noticing that he was starting to get jaundice, which he had some bilirubin when he was born, but our daughter had already had that too, and she didn't need lights or anything like that. So it seemed like pretty standard stuff. All of his checkups, he was fine. Around like 3 or 4 months, we started noticing that he like stopped tracking certain things, certain items. And he was starting to get the jaundice, was like doing different body parts. So like one day his whole left arm would be yellow, and then the next day it would be like his right leg would be yellow. And it was like super strange. And we would call the pediatrician often. And the pediatrician tried to reassure us that as like he was feeding and he was breastfeeding and going to the bathroom, as long as all of those good things are happening, we probably shouldn't be too alarmed. So we tried to keep our worries down. And it wasn't until he started to get kind of sickly. He wasn't really moving his body. He was really weak. His arms he wasn't like moving his body as much. And when we brought him in, his doctor had deemed him a failure to thrive. So we went into the hospital, and we went to Lurie's in Chicago, and they saw his labs and said that he had to have 2 blood transfusions. And then we ended up going home. So there was no diagnosis at that time. But then within like 4 or 5 days, he can just continue to like very quickly decline. His eyes weren't moving so much. He wasn't making any sounds. He physically didn't have a voice. It was really, really, really scary for us during that time. Especially, I'm sure a lot of you understand, when you're calling the doctor and the doctor's like, it's okay, these are momentary. So then when we went back, they said, we need to go back to Lurie's. He had actually lost some weight. He wasn't keeping his breast milk down, and he was overall just very lethargic, still very jaundiced. And then when we were hospitalized for 22 consecutive days in Chicago. And like I've said before, we have an 8-year-old, an almost 8-year-old daughter who is just starting out the school year. And so that was really hard. And we're really, really thankful for all of our family who helped navigate that part with us to get her to school. But Casey saw lots of doctors. His team was how I describe like a football team. Like there was a lot of different doctors on his case. Hematology, there was neuro and neuroscience, feed specialists, OT, PT were in there every day. Neurosurgery was in there, ophthalmology was in there, genetics was in there. We were just kind of waiting for test results to come back. And it wasn't until we got some blood labs back where we saw some of his levels were overall everywhere. And they had diagnosed him with an inborn error of metabolism with genetics. And then they kind of took us under their wing. And then when Casey was about 6 months old, we thought we were kind of navigating this part of his cobalamin, and he started having seizures at home around Christmas. And that's when we were readmitted to the hospital for 5 days, where he was diagnosed with epilepsy. And he started on medication with them. And then at the current time, he's still navigating that, but right now he's seizure free. He's on his Keppra, and so he's responding really well to treatment and still seeing OT, PT, and genetics.
Thank you. I'm glad that he is responding to that treatment. That's good news. So you talked about all of the different doctors that Casey had to see. Do you remember which doctor first thought maybe he had a type of HCU?
A lot of the time, they would all come in together, and we would kind of discuss things openly. My husband and I, what we called it a war board in his hospital room. There was a whiteboard that I'm not sure what they normally use it for. We used it for writing diagnosis down. We were writing things down, and then the team would come in the next morning and they would say, this is why these things don't match up. One of the things on the board was vitamin B12 deficiency. And I do remember that a lot of people were interested that we wrote that. They were wondering where that was gathered from. And then I think hematology was the first group of people that was looking into his cell size and how that would develop into that. And then I think hematology, collided with genetics a little bit, is when they kind of called them in, because so many of Casey's tests were coming back negative. And I think that's where they got together. I don't know exactly maybe who first said it, but I think that it was a buzzing topic among all of his providers. And I know that there was a lot of shock with that being the diagnosis, for sure. A lot of his providers that came in that were signing off at that point once he was diagnosed they were all kind of sharing that that's not something that's common, and especially the thought. So kind of what your question is like, it wasn't even something that was on everybody's radar. So I can imagine that there was a shining star in that group that maybe we don't know the exact answer to, but I'm really glad that genetics signed on and they were able to navigate that.
All right, thank you. Melanie, I think you said that Mason HCU didn't really come into the picture until he saw an eye doctor. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And even on that day at the eye doctor's appointment, that specific diagnosis wasn't brought up. It was sort of just by chance that we ended up seeing this eye doctor we hadn't seen before. Mason had been wearing glasses since kindergarten, so routine eye doctor's appointments were pretty normal for us. But on this day, a different doctor was in the office. They asked if we'd be okay seeing him. We said sure. And he was quite young. And I later learned it was actually his, first couple of months in practice. And he is the one who, while he was examining Mason, saw something happening with his lenses, which I know now, did not know then, is very common with undiagnosed classical homocystinuria. So he ended up asking Mason to leave the room. Mason's a really social kid. He was fine. He wanted to go out and chat with the staff and look at glasses. So it was fine, but I knew something was wrong if he was asking that. And he asked me a lot of questions about Mason's health and his body, and I didn't know where he was going. And to be honest, I don't think he specifically knew he was even thinking of homocystinuria, but he was smart enough, well-read enough, remembered enough from his schooling so recently that this type of connective tissue disorder was on his radar. Thank goodness.
All right, thank you for that. Julie, do you remember which doctor you finally landed on that thought maybe metabolic disorder might be the answer to what was going on?
Yes, it was her neurologist who just suggested genetic testing in general. She didn't specifically name any of her like thoughts. She said just you should do it, and that took a little while to kind of work out, like, what does this cost? Who's going to cover it? Does insurance cover it? What are we even testing for? That was a little confusing in general. So it took months for us to get it together and get the kit, and then it takes months to come back, or at least it did for us. So, and I got a call in the car, and I remember the geneticist saying, "Well, we do have we have a hit. We know what it is now." And she told me, she said about MTHFR, and then she said, "So how do you feel?" And I said, like, what? I was driving. I had no idea like what she had just said, or I had never heard of any of these words. So I said, I can't say how I feel. I have no idea. I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm still really confused, to be honest. I'm writing things down as other people are talking, like, trying to make some connections.
Yeah,
So.
and that's okay too, because this will be a big help to people who are going to be in your shoes in the future, because it's scary when you first get that diagnosis or you first know that something's wrong. Like that's a scary feeling. Everybody that I've interviewed has talked about just how overwhelming it is to not know what's going to happen with your kids. So yeah, that's totally
Although
understandable.
I'm sorry, I also did feel so relieved though that there was one, like, that we had a diagnosis after all these like juggling and trying to, all the mystery, to know that, okay, we're not nuts, like there's something going on and this all makes sense now. That was a relief.
Yeah, it's easier to fight when you know what you're fighting.
Right.
So a lot of times with metabolic disorders, there are several misdiagnoses before we hit the correct one. And I'll open this up because I don't know all the ins and outs of your stories, but anybody that wants to speak certainly can. Were there any misdiagnoses before you landed on the correct one?
I can start. We didn't have any actual diagnoses in particular. However, the eye doctor did bring up the term Marfan syndrome during that appointment. I had never heard of that term before. It was never on the radar as a diagnosis. However, it was brought up at that time, and unfortunately, I got a little Google happy after that, and it led me in a lot of crazy directions. Unfortunately, because like you had just said, Ben, you kind of go down this crazy rabbit hole of what's going to happen to my child. Like everything changed that day at that eye doctor's appointment for me. And I knew there was something. I knew like, this is it. There's something's going to happen. I don't know what it is. And I wanted to know that day. And we didn't get the diagnosis for a couple more months. And during that time, they did allow us to do certain tests, like on his heart, and certain things, because I was spiraling. I was calling the doctor every other day. Like, what are we testing next? How are we figuring out exactly what's going on here? So while it wasn't a specific misdiagnosis, and I know that we're lucky it was only a couple months, because I understand that people can go a lot longer than that trying to figure it out. So I'm grateful that it only took a couple of months, but it was probably the worst couple of months that I could ever imagine.
Thank you for sharing. Anybody else want to jump in?
I can jump in. With the 22 consecutive day stay, it felt like they were like racing. And I think it's because while we were hospitalized, Casey continued to decline, like just right in front of everybody. And all different providers, like we were talking about, coming in and throwing out theories, throwing out ideas, taking labs, trying to like piggyback off of other labs, so that we didn't have to keep taking so many labs from him because he had just had the 2 blood transfusions. So I think the very first team that jumped in was definitely thinking that he had some sort of blood disease, blood disorder, something going on. So the first thing that we heard back from was G6PD, and I might mispronounce this, I'm sorry, hereditary spherocytosis. And so there was like 2 different types of anemia, and one is very severe. There was a lot of like back and forth on, we had done some testing when we were pregnant, and he was completely ruled out for having any type of anemia. And so we were trying to like get those providers back in, from like the high risk doctors, from our OBGYN's office, and trying to get them on board, trying to go over, you know, all those files and where things kind of went. And that took kind of like a lot of, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to, that took a lot of time during those 22 days. So even when somebody said, I have a theory, it wasn't like tomorrow we'll have a yes or a no. It was like throughout that time. And we didn't get that exact diagnosis until probably like the 20th or like the 21st day. Because then once we had a diagnosis, they were like, here's our plan of treatment and here's how you can do this at home. And obviously we were very anxious to get back home to our daughter and our home and our lives outside of that. And so we were kind of going off of a lot of different things as well, because Casey had a subdermal hemorrhage. So he had a pocket of fluid. So they were kind of going off of different diagnoses for that. And then they were having a theory that maybe he had some heart, kidney function. So we were looking at those diagnoses and having those people rule those things out. And then we got to the inborn error of metabolism, and we're still navigating that with Casey, and still navigating over what that means for that.
All right. Thank you for that, Shaina. Julie, were there any misdiagnoses with Amy?
I'm not sure if they're misdiagnoses or maybe just like part of the like metabolic issue itself, but we just sort of tackled them like one at a time. I mean, at first we thought she was dyslexic, and so she went to a private school for language-based learning disabilities for 9 years, and we thought, okay, we've got it sorted. That's what she needed. She needed small classes, but that then as she started to decline and had some cognitive decline, we realized, well, that's not it. She also has an autism diagnosis, which I don't think I mentioned before. And she only got that like less than a year before we found out. And I don't know if now, knowing what we know now, if she would have received that diagnosis or not, or then again, that is something that could be kind of comorbid with this. So I don't know if it's like wrong or if it's just all wrapped up together. Yeah, those are the only 2 that I could think of as like, you know, maybe that wasn't it. Maybe it was just part of this larger situation.
Right. All right. Thank you. So this next discussion point that we go to is a lot of times the scariest, and it's the one that people have the most to say about. So thankfully we've got a couple of extra minutes for this. So moving on to the official diagnosis and initial treatments of that. So some of the things I'd like to talk about is when you first heard your diagnosis, whether it was cobalamin C severe MTHFR or HC&U, what did the doctors first tell you, and what were your initial reactions to that news? Melanie, if you don't mind starting.
Yeah, so we actually got a phone call on a weekend from our pediatrician. Finally, one of the blood tests had come back, and was the correct blood test at this point. And this pediatrician of ours said, I think it's something called homocystinuria. Of course, we'd never heard of it. It sounded like he hadn't really heard of it. And he was quite frank with us in that he doesn't have a lot of information. From what he was reading, it sounded like he was just reading it, was that, this can be treated, which as soon as we heard that, there was a massive weight lifted, because we did have concerns that what was going on with Mason wasn't going to be treatable. So that was great in that sense. But of course, it left a massive amount of questions. And it was a Saturday. So he said we'd hear from the BC the Children's Hospital in our area on Monday for a genetics team, someone who actually does know a lot about it. And in the meantime, all he could really tell us is that he believes it's treatable with a low protein diet. And my husband and I kind of hung up and kind of thought, okay, well, I guess he's just not really going to eat much meat. We were so naive. Okay, we can handle that. Like, oh my gosh, this is such a relief. Still obviously concerned, and we didn't go on Google. After everything that happened prior, it's just not a good idea, and I don't regret it. I'm glad I didn't. I didn't need to go down all those different routes and start thinking of all these worst case scenarios, because that's what would have happened. So we waited till Monday, and we got the call from the genetics team, and we started with them, and that's how we moved on to our treatment plan and moved on to actually fully understanding what it meant to have this disorder and what it meant to actually be on a low protein diet and to change your little guy's life forever.
Well, yeah, definitely. That's always the hardest. Most people, when I talk to them, that's the hardest part of the diagnosis, is the restrictive diet. Could you go ahead and talk a little bit about what therapies or medications, obviously the low protein diet, but what did they recommend when you first got the diagnosis?
So yes, of course, the low protein diet, and that that took a couple of months to kind of master what his tolerance was going to be. Did a lot of blood tests. I think we were doing weekly at first, then bi-weekly and monthly. But also the formula that we didn't know or expect that. And of course, then learning that this formula also tastes terrible. There was that. So right off the bat, it was change up the diet and the formula. We did move on to the butane. That was a couple of months later. I want to say maybe 6 months later, when they realized, okay, his levels are dropping, but we can probably do better. So we also have that as part of his treatment plan. So it's those three things combined.
And the answer to this may be no, but was there anything that you had been doing to treat the symptoms that had presented themselves before the diagnosis that you were able to stop once they figured out, hey, this is HC&U, we don't have to do this certain thing anymore? Did that happen with you?
It's almost a no, except that he was using these particular eye drops because they just thought he had regular myopia, which these eye drops are supposed to help with that. And he had been using them for a couple of years, actually. And I think when the doctor, realized he's been on these eye drops, what's going on here? They were doing absolutely nothing. The most useless eye drops we could have possibly been giving him for all those years. But that is really it. There wasn't anything else going on. So.
All right, thank you. Shaina, we'll go to you. What did they initially tell you about cobalamin C, and what were your initial thoughts when you heard that diagnosis?
We were relieved to get a diagnosis in the way of just like no more wandering in some ways. When the genetics team came in to talk about it, they came in as a whole team, and really they brought case studies for my husband and I to read over. And they were telling us that they have a lot of different patients that they work with, that they're familiar with this, and that even though there's not a ton of data and that there's not, a ton of information, they felt like they had a lot to share with us. And that actually made us feel a lot better about, because once we heard about this, I mean, we even had to write it down several times. We were trying to go over it. We were trying to figure out what it is. We kept being inborn error of metabolism. What does that mean? And I know we had a huge debate on, do we go down Google? Do we try to figure this out? And because inborn error of metabolism, that's kind of the umbrella for the cobalamin. It was at first we didn't know exactly what it was. And of course, when you Google it, you're going to see the scariest stuff. And so once the team came back, we had 1,000 questions for them. Because what they first told us, obviously the case study, they had the good, they felt like they had a good understanding of the patients that they have under the treatment plan that they would recommend, that they were showing good data. But they talked to us a lot about Casey's eyesight. So that was one of the first people that came to the room within an hour, to come and evaluate where his eyesight was at. So once ophthalmology had said that Casey's eyes looked great, we felt okay, that's our first stepping stone here. And then it was next to my husband and I learning how to do the injections. So we both did that 2 nights, one each, and then we were learning about all the different kinds of medications. And because Casey is a baby, at first they were like, oh, it's in pill form, so we'll have to get creative on how to give this to him. And at the time he had all the, that I again don't want to say misdiagnosis, but he had an NG feed in, with breast milk going to him every 4 hours, that I was pumping for him at the hospital. And so they were like, how do we figure out how to get this to him? And so we still, to this day, we still syringe pumped milk, and that's how we give him his leucovorin. So, I mean, we were learning about the medication and how we could kind of navigate it with his age. When kids get older, they're sometimes better with certain medications. So having a baby was how do we navigate this? They talked a lot about how they had some local families, and that they could reach out to those families and see if they would be interested in connecting with us. And I think checking in with that family and seeing if we could get this connected bridge of we don't want you to go home and feel alone. I think that was just a game changer for us. We got connected to this community, I think, fairly quickly. And it really was extremely helpful for them to kind of share that knowledge, and for, our doctor to also know some of the people that we know, and to kind of be able to connect in that way it's very different. Very, very different.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that made you feel like you were not alone, and
Yeah.
that other people that could relate to what you're going through, because it is such a rare thing. It's good to know that there are other people, with you.
Yeah, it was hard to hear the word rare, for sure. And just my husband being very analytical was, asking for numbers and data, and it was good to have those case studies. But because our growth of knowledge, changes all the time, with more connectiveness, I think that's what kind of changes a lot of things. And that was really good information to kind of find out from them. And that rare didn't seem so scary anymore once they were like, but here we have people we can connect you with. You're not alone in this. And you don't have to go home and feel that way. So that was really great for us.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Julie, how about you? When you first got the diagnosis of severe MTHFR, what did they tell you about that diagnosis initially, and what were your feelings?
Sure. They didn't actually say severe MTHFR. They said hyperhomocystinemia due to MTHFR deficiency. So, I wrote down those words, and but I still to this day don't really understand the difference between severe MTHFR and an MTHFR deficiency. And her doctor seems to think, and I spoke with him recently, that severe can only be for early onset, neonatal kind of stuff. So I'm not sure. This is why I was saying I have so many questions. Yeah, so that's what they told me, and I didn't really know what to do. But he said, "Oh, she's going to feel so much better. We're going to give her betaine. You know, we know what to do with this." And he asked if she went to school, and I said, "Yeah, she goes to school." And he said, "Wow, that's great. Lots of people who have this have no activities." And I was thinking, like, what does that mean? You know, like he was, you know, he seemed surprised how um, like capable she was. But she was, you know, in a lot of pain and was walking very slowly and was sort of in a fog. And the betaine certainly helped with that, although it has side effects that are pretty debilitating for her. And she's on 43 grams a day. And whenever I talk to someone, they're like, they have much younger children or much smaller children. So it's like they can't even believe it. It seems like, you know, like a ton, and it is a ton. So she has 3 smoothies a day, and it, you know, it helps. But something else I wanted to share, just she was on Keppra for a long time, and we switched seizure medications about like 4 months ago because she was having headaches, and they switched us to we're switching to lamotrigine. I'm sorry, we were on Topamax in between Keppra and lamotrigine. And my daughter, who's studying to be a nurse, found a study that said Topamax can actually, it's not good for people with homocysteine issues. And her homocysteine had shot up ever since she started the Topamax. So we are now taking her off the Topamax and putting her onto the lamotrigine, which is, I don't know if anyone else has experienced that. But it was like a tiny study that just my daughter happened to find. And so our hope is that once we can get her off it and off the Topamax, you know, maybe the betaine will start to work again, because it almost like blocked it. Her homocysteine went up another 30 points.
Wow, I'm glad that your daughter found that study. That's
Yeah.
very fortunate that she was able to find that. So 43 grams of betaine.
Yeah.
I only take 18 grams, and I'm a big boy, you know?
Yeah.
Um, so what other medication does she take specifically for that
She
MTHFR?
also takes the leucovorin as well. And then you know, tons of B vitamins, um, and sertraline for anxiety, and she takes Adderall for ADHD, and then, you know, just other things that we buy to try to help some of her side effects. You know, like she takes uh like different vitamins. We've even tried charcoal pills to try to help, because the betaine has a terrible odor that she's experienced. So we've really just been B2 riboflavin, kind of, we heard might help with that, so we've tried that. So yeah, she's got a pretty hefty pill case, as do probably most of the people on the call.
I read in your patient story that she has taken those treatments though and done very well and
Yeah,
has
she's
explained
a
just,
champ.
yep.
But you know, the doctor never mentioned the word homocystinuria, even with all of like everything else they were saying. They never said that word. So that's, you know, I kind of went down a Google hole and I found that word and this organization, um, and I realized that eye issues could be part of this. And I brought her to the eye doctor, and then they said, "Oh, she's got swollen optic nerves. You should bring her right to the ER." And that's when we found out she needed a spinal tap. And but I only knew to even go to the eye doctor because of, you know, this organization and reading about other people's experiences. It's like the pediatrician has had nothing to do. You know, most of her doctors have never heard of this, and I have to explain, or they're Googling right while we're there, you know. So that's the hard part about the rare nature of it.
That is a great segue into the next discussion point. We could spend a lot more time on this one, but we're going to come up against it soon. So let me move on to settling in with the diagnosis. Obviously, you guys are active members in the HCU community. You found HCU Network America. Could you talk a little bit about what finding this community has meant to you, how that's helped you in your journey? We can start back with Melanie, if that's okay.
Sure. It was only probably a couple weeks to a month or two after the diagnosis that I ended up finding HC Network America. I wasn't directed to them by anybody. I am in Canada, keep in mind. But even still, I wish that I'd been directed to them right away. I did that just from like Facebook groups and that kind of thing. Immediately, I wanted to connect. I know that's not everyone's experience. Sometimes you need time. For me, I was just like that night, the next day, immediately. I just wanted to be around or hear other people talk about this because, of course, no one else in my life could talk about it with me, really, except for just all the questions. So I wanted some answers. And I wanted to hear, I understood I'd hear some tough stuff, but I also wanted to hear the positive things. And I wanted to hear about the adults with homocystinuria. When I found HC&U Network America, there was a couple Zoom events coming up. I think one of them was like going back to school or something like that. And it had to do with things that didn't really, affect me because we don't do like our schools don't do lunches and stuff like that. So, but I didn't care. I'm like, I'm just going to get on and listen to people talk. And I did. And I didn't have a ton to say, but I just listened to everybody. And that's actually how I met one of my closest friends now, Liz, through that particular call. So I'm so glad I went on there. But I can't stress enough how important I think community is. I think it's a whole other side of the treatment. It's a therapy and it's a game changer.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to Shaina. Sorry, you're muted, Shaina.
Could you repeat your question for me really quick? Sorry.
Yeah. Could you just talk about how finding this community, the HC&U community, HC&U Network America, what has that meant to you? How has that helped you on your journey?
The kind of the similar experience is like first thing I did when Casey was hospitalized is I was sharing to social media. A part of that war board was like a lot of feedback from people, and people would comment and be like, look into this. And those were some of the suggestions that went onto those boards that actually became really big conversations. And I'm sure half those people don't even know how much of an impact that actually became a part of Casey's story. But I mean, overall, having that every day being like, this is what we're doing, this is where we're going, and having people send in so much like advice and words and cards and all kinds of things was so great. So at first I was like looking up like very specific things. I was looking up like inborn error metabolism family groups, and like I wasn't really getting anything. And so I kind of like went away from that for a minute, getting the almost like a referral or refer a friend from our doctors was really great, because then I had a mom to text that was going through the same thing that I was going through, and with her family, and it was so relieving for me. And then that kind of led to, once he started having the seizures, I was literally sitting in the hospital, and it was right before Christmas, and I was like, I'm just gonna jump on this. I'm gonna try to find, and I was like putting in keywords, and finally this group came up, and I was like, all right, let me check this out. And right away I got hey, this is our new member. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on? And I was kind of like, this is a lot to explain. And we were like in the midst of one of our hospital stays. So I was like, I don't even know what to say right now. And I was like, I'm just gonna, once Casey goes to sleep, I'm gonna put it aside, and I'm really gonna like pour my heart out. I'm gonna put like what's going on. And the feedback was immediate. Like I had so many people just flooding, my inbox and reaching out to me and like friend requesting immediately. So that made me feel like so seen and so like heard and validated. And I really felt like, okay, like I'm going to learn more about this, and I'm going to learn how to navigate as like Casey gets older. And I was even reading like even like older kids' stories, and I just wanted to learn more and learn more. And at first I wasn't, I guess I like maybe didn't go back too far, but I got connected with Danae, and when we got connected, it was New Year's Eve, kind of right after we got home, and I was having like a really like, with him having his seizures, like I was so scared. And we were just sitting at home. Like we didn't even want to have plans. We didn't want to see anybody. We were so shut down from wanting to do anything. And they sent me this poem called Holland. And I don't know if any of you guys have read it, but it is definitely a poem that I almost feel like should be like the forefront of like navigating a maze. I just want to make sure I reference it. It's by Emily Pearl Kingsley. I just kept saying to Danae, like, I just like wish this wasn't happening. Like I have another child, and like they're they're healthy. Like, why is this happening to Casey? And I was so concerned. And she just spent her whole night on New Year's Eve just like sending me HC&U hero stories. And my husband and I literally sat here with Casey in between us, and we read everybody's hero stories, and we cried for hours. And we felt so much hope. Even though it was like really hard to read about some of the stories, and a lot of the struggles, but it was also like, oh my gosh, I've been there. I've been on that gray couch too. I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to do those injections. I know what it feels like to take that leucovorin. Like, I know how it feels as a parent. And then you're watching your child, and like, no matter what age they're at, like, I've seen a couple of the parents commenting that have been on a part of this group for a long time. I saw some of the posts like 2015, 2014. I was like, oh wow, like, I didn't even know how long this group's been going on for. But I needed Danae to kind of like, I needed that night. That night meant so much to me, and everybody just coming in, talking to us about Casey and giving us new suggestions on how to give us injections when he started squirming around. And I don't know why we didn't think to just like flip him over and let him be on his tummy, but somebody said it and it worked. And I was like, thank goodness for this group.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Julie, your thoughts on the importance of community, how it's helped you?
Well, I mean, like other everyone else was saying, it's very overwhelming at first, so it's helpful just to even make a contact, with one or two people. I haven't found many people who have a child with her exact condition and her age. So I'm still hoping that to make more connections. But I did watch also a panel, at least one panel where I heard that Danae was moderating, and I watched that a couple times, and it just gave me some ideas about what I needed to ask my doctor. And I mean, we go to a major hospital in New York City. And, I thought that they should, I hear people talking about newborn screenings and how it was caught. And I thought, this wasn't even an option. And, I would think that in a big city, people might know more about this. So it just gave me a lot to think about. And also Liz was super helpful. She shared with me some slides that she uses to give to the classroom teacher and other people like the school nurse that had basic information and, what to look for. And that was really helpful. I gave it to her school this year. She started a new school. So I really appreciated that. So even, little things like that might not have seemed like a big deal really meant a lot and were very helpful. And it's something I'm going to use, for the rest of her school career for sure.
All right. Thank you for that. And there's one more thing that I want to ask. I know we are running out of time and we have a Q&A session to get to, but so we'll try to keep these answers brief. But I would like each of you to give your number one piece of advice to newly diagnosed families, because that is, I think, the scariest, most difficult part of the journey is just getting started. So if you could just give your number one piece of advice to those families.
I think
Melanie?
I think we kind of maybe just all said it. For me, I would say it's community. It's finding more people that understand what you're going through and that you can have discussions with and that you can learn from. I think it's, hands down the most beneficial part of this entire experience.
Shaina, anybody else like to jump in before we move on to Q&A?
I literally wrote for this answer to create an HC&U family directory. I would love if we had almost like a manual to say, this is the group of people that I'd like to reach out to and connect with, and these are their kids' ages, and this is where I fall with my own family. And like, I feel like that would be like the perfect thing, which is basically this group. And I think that that's extremely helpful. I would absolutely say to continue to search, ask those questions on this group. I wouldn't recommend Google. I would recommend this group. I think that that's going to be kind of my whole entire answer, is that connecting with the HC&U community is going to guide you in the right direction. I just also wanted to say that, like, when we were talking about the different Keppra medications, Julie was like, when you're talking about those different medications, always you know, that's a great research, is like to talk to the HC&U about and say, these are the medications that, you know, were suggested. And I would really like to know if these affect other things within the HC&U community. So that's always like a great discussion that I see on here often too.
All right, thank you. Anything?
Yeah, I would agree. You know, same thing. Try to reach out and talk to as many people as possible. And I think also with doctors, if they don't seem to know anything about it, you know, you can refer them to groups like this, because it seems like a lot of times we, as the community, have to educate the physicians sometimes about, you know, what it's like and what it is.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Before I turn it back over to Danae, I just wanted to say thank you guys for being on the panel. Your kids are lucky to have you as moms. Y'all are doing a great job. And thank you for sharing your story. That is, you don't know how much that empowers people. Sometimes we lose perspective of that, but sometimes just hearing stories from people that have lived it makes a big difference. So thank you all for being with us. And then I'll turn it back to Danae.
My gosh, I have so many feelings, and I have to say I just appreciate the vulnerability and everything that you guys have shared with us. I do have a question. You know, when we think about, you know, as parents, they always say the days are long, the years are fast, like those kind of things. And, you know, the whole process, there's so much emotion, and, you know, the days sometimes they don't feel like they're going to end, especially if you've had those hospital stays. Um, One thing that I know that frequently I hear from parents is, you know, they always are amazed like a year after their diagnosis or a few months, like, I can't believe I'm at this point now. And so I always think it's important to celebrate the littlest milestones and the littlest successes, because in dealing with a condition that can feel so daunting and overwhelming, those little things are major wins. And so I am curious for you guys, looking back on your journey that you've navigated so far, what do you feel has been your biggest success? Or what is like one of the most memorable things, like positive moments in this journey too? That might be an easier question.
I think for myself, I think more of Mason, because for an 8-year-old little boy to have to change his entire diet and start drinking something really, quite frankly, nasty, multiple times a day with no end in sight. I remember thinking, how on earth are we going to do this? Like this, it really honestly seemed impossible. There were people, I think it was you, Danae, and also my dietitian, I remember specifically saying, just keep going. It's actually going to get easier. If you look back in like a year, you're going to be like, wow, like I've come so far. And I held on to that first year, because there were a lot of days where I didn't know what I would feed him for the next meal. And it's horrifying feeling to not know how you're going to nourish your child. So when I look back about and think about some of the positives, I think about how my child was able to eat these new foods, and quite frankly, he did it happily. I'm so proud of him. He is the coolest kid, and he is so resilient. I always say I hate that he has to be, but he is. And he understands his diet, and he understands to his age level why he needs to be on this diet, and he just does it. And for myself, come up with a lot of ideas on how to keep him healthy, and I'm also really proud of that.
I'll just jump in here. I would almost agree that when I think about what's been positive since we were diagnosed in October, I can't believe how like long that that like month, really until like December felt like, that felt like years. And it was really such a short period of time, and to be where we are today is nowhere on our radar. I think that I would be seeing Casey do the things that he's doing today. And I think that watching him just be happy, it feels so good to also come out of the survival mode I felt like we had kind of gotten into with like provider appointment, medication, provider appointment. Like it felt like you couldn't think about anything else except this. I couldn't have conversation with other adults unless it was about this for a really long time. And so to kind of finally get to a point where Casey was like stabilizing and things were okay for this moment. And I was able to like get him into a baby class and just take him to go meet other babies and just be around parents who are just parents and to finally have conversation about his successes rather than like, I'm so scared for when I'm worried about this. I'm freaked out for this point. This is this milestone. What if this like, it was finally this like clarifying moment of just like, okay, like everything that we're doing is working and it's okay for right now. We're like, he's on this treatment. We've got this great team. I feel like the providers is something that's just like, you have to hand that off to them, is like, they're doing so much to keep Casey stabilized. I feel like he's got so many different providers that have eyes on him. And as much as our weeks are filled with lots of appointments, OT, PT, genetics, epilepsy, like we're still seeing all these providers, but it's rather like a scary, like, are we going to live at the hospital again feeling? It's more like we're checking in and we're looking at where he's at, and we're no longer like trying to catch our breath. We're finally like able to just enjoy this moment and seeing him smile all the time, even when he's getting his medications. For some reason, Casey laughs when he gets his hydroxycobalamin injections in his legs. I'm not sure if it's because it's cold, but he started laughing, and well, we'll take it as a win.
Julie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think it's a really hard question. I don't mean to seem ungrateful. It's hard to
No.
think of one thing. I feel like she's due some wins.
Yeah. No, and it is hard. It's and I'll tell you, there are going to be periods in life that it just feels like the odds are stacked against you. And I as an adult patient, I have last fall, winter was like one of those time periods in my life. I'm like, all right, I really would like to catch a break now. And it was literally every single month there was something else. I'm like, all right, can my Christmas present be? No, Christmas, we're not going to give you that break. But there does become a break in the rain. And I think one of the biggest things for myself, and I have shared this many times, this is not about Danae time, but really, the place for me getting to the point where co-founding HC Network America happened in a hospital, because I had had a blood clot and I was so desperate. I had no community. Like Facebook was still new and there was no one, and my clinic had not connected me with anyone. And I said, I never want anyone to feel this alone. But it wasn't even HCU that I connected with first. It was another community with follow the same kind of low protein diet and medical formula. And they're the ones that I called home. And, when you start connecting with people, you start building understanding and resource and tools to help you with these daily things. And I think that's the most important thing. The treatments are obviously extremely important, but that day-to-day support and, people who understand how to navigate some of these obstacles, because the doctors, they're amazing at what they do, but they only know so much. And when we pool our knowledge and resources together as patients, we are an incredible force. And, we know so much because we live so much. And, those doctors are lucky if they get like a paragraph. And so it's really important to network with each other and to share. And, eventually you become that parent that other people can go to, or that patient. And it can be overwhelming though, but it takes it takes time and it takes community. And, you know, you showing up is the most important thing you can do for your daughter. And we are so excited to be able to meet all of you at our conference this fall. Not fall, this summer.
Yeah.
Good thing it's not the fall. But I want to thank everyone who's listened in this evening. I hope you'll continue celebrating World Homocystinuria Awareness Day with us tomorrow, which is the official day for World Homocystinuria Awareness Day. And please join us for future events. Thank you.